I also put some quotes, so if you find it boring, you can always pay attention to the quotes and just read them, and just, it kind of gives you stuff to do. So here's the plan of my presentation. I'll just say a few things about the point of reference here, imitation and mimesis. I'll start with kicking off with Plato and Aristotle and their reading of the problem. I'll show how Kierkegaard is situated in the whole thing, and I will. That's section 2, 3, and 4. I will cover specific subjects that are related to imitation in Kierkegaard. And under 2 we have repetition. I'll focus on the work, one of his early works, which is called Repetition. And I'll talk about how repetition kind of qualifies or tells us about serious consideration of human experience in the world in time. I'll talk about movement, imagination, and existence. Then a few words about this very interesting category of redoubling or reduplication, which has this existential dimension there. And fourth, I'll talk about kind of a standard subject that Kierkegaard discusses when talking about imitation, the problem of image or representation and the prototypes. Okay. So the subject of this lecture, in a sense, is also related to my PhD thesis, which is subtitled "The Problem and the Cure," which means that imitation in Kierkegaard is something that Kierkegaard is very, very suspicious of. He's critical of, but he also thinks that there are ways of looking at the problem of imitation, which I understand as some sort of a cure to human condition. So the other perspective is the perspective of mimesis. So and I kind of approach the problem of imitation in Kierkegaard in relation to the notion of mimesis. In that sense, I'm going in a sense a step up, right? So I'm trying to think how we can understand the problem of imitation if we look at it in a sense from the perspective of mimesis. Obviously mimesis has no perspective, but I'm kind of anglicizing my kind of thought here. So a few things about that. Mimesis allows us to kind of see the problem of imitation from a higher, in a sense, perspective. This is when I focus on mimesis. This is not to say that I merely focus on the imitation, right? But I rather deal with the problem of imitation head on. So far, the problem of imitation was dealt in relation to some other problems, like suffering, or what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to be a human being. But I'm kind of dealing with this problem. I'm taking it on board, and I'm really focusing on that problem of imitation. Here are some questions that allow us to understand my approach. I ask questions such as, what does Kierkegaard mean when he uses the term imitation? What are his points of reference in his conceptualization of imitation? 3. To what extent Kierkegaard is in fact interested in imitation? Is it something major thing or something actually idiosyncratic he deals with on the way with dealing with other problems? It's just a prop. And number 4, what can we learn today about imitation from Kierkegaard's theory of imitation or engagement of imitation? Kierkegaard does not really present any theory as such. Okay. So here are a few terms that Kierkegaard uses to describe, broadly speaking, the mimesis-oriented realm or the mimetic realm. So the general idea in the scholarship on Kierkegaard is that Kierkegaard uses just this term, which from Danish translated into English would mean to follow after. So it's not some sort of mimesis, imitation understood as some sort of representation of a thing, or just some sort of a representation of an object or an action or a mimicry, but it rather means following after. So that's what the scholarship is about, but I just kind of delineated the variety of terms and concepts he actually uses in his authorship. So there is a few, right? So you have likeness, to liken oneself, ligne, then to compare, then there is a problem of comparison, sammenligning, then after göre, which is going and doing after, so efterfolgelse, which means following someone, but after göre is actually doing something after, right? Then you have aping, efterabelse, mimic, mimical, redoublers, redoubling, reduplication, double, okay, plenty, right? As this is quite important because this kind of very much challenges the understanding of the subject we have in the contemporary literature. And here is an example of one quotation, and those of you who don't know Kierkegaard, you will kind of start. You can start familiarize yourself with Kierkegaard, and there is a quotation in which Kierkegaard actually uses a variety of mimetic terms. So the quotation goes as follows: although there is Sunday palaver about Christ as the exalted prototype, so you have a very foundational term for bilede, the Christian prototype, the Christian strives to resemble, and you have very pedestrian term ligne here, right? Resemble. It is always understood that no one is foolish enough to want to do any such thing, and that's a bad translation, but basically do after that. So that's what is actually here, right? Foolish enough to do exactly that. Right? That's what the translation should be. And to continue, this is what Christendom calls piety, fear of God. If, however, someone makes an attempt to place the prototype into actuality in such a way that the imitation, and then you have imitation, the word efterfolgelse, right? Somewhere here, might get to be in earnest, then they say this is blasphemy. Consequently, the truth is blasphemy. So just, you have the whole quotation, but the idea here is that Kierkegaard has a variety of terms. He just doesn't just use one term to describe this phenomenon of the imitation of Christ. Pretty much it. Okay. So let me just do some work in terms of general remarks about what mimesis or what imitation is. I believe we all have some sort of a natural intuition about the term, but let's just say a few things about the term. The concept of mimesis is difficult to pinpoint since its conceptual formulation in the dialects of Plato. It has carried different connotations depending on the period and context. So even in the antiquity, there was not one understanding of that term. Moreover, individual thinkers do not have one specific understanding of mimesis. Rather, they apprise it in diverse ways. This is an interesting thing. For example, in the Republic, Plato recommends avoiding mimesis as it seduces gullible people into mistaking appearances for reality and effectively undermines the social fabric of the ideal polis. Right? So it's a very critical outlook in the Republic on mimesis. Yet in Laws, he apprises mimesis positively and even recommends it. Mimesis underwrites the structure of the ideal state, as the successful function of the state is based on imitation, appropriation, and implementation of the prototypical modes of existence guided by some virtues. So on the one hand, you have critical appraisal of imitation in the Republic. Poets should be expelled from the polis. They are corrupting the vision of the ideal polis. But the same author, the same thinker, has a very positive appraisal of imitation in his another of his dialogues, the Laws. The other thing is that no translation of the term the Greek term mimesis into any language is capable of exhausting or securing its multivocal meaning. It can designate, and the quotation here from Gebauer and Wolff, it can designate emulation, mimicry, dissimulation, doubling, theatricality, realism, identification, correspondence, depiction, verisimilitude, resemblance, but also similarity, appearance, illusion, education, development. So plethora of meanings there. Furthermore, mimesis qualifies the distinction between the real and the unreal, original, copy, true, untrue, ethical, unethical, similarity and distortion, plenty, right? Lastly, it pertains to different disciplines and has both individual and social dimension. And Gebauer and Wolff, it's another quotation which I decided to put it on. How they put it: mimesis makes it possible for individuals to step out of themselves, to draw the outer world into their inner world, and to lend expression to their interiority. And this is something that Kierkegaard is actually attentive to, that you can actually use mimesis in such a way that you can actually think about yourself from another perspective. Like literature can do that, right? Philosophy can do that, but also other fields. Theater can do that. But it also allows us to think about ourselves as I can think about myself as someone else. So if coming back to the workshop, which some of you attended, but the rest of you will attend today, you can envision yourself as someone in the future. And this is what mimesis allow you to do. You can think about yourself as a scholar, as a successful one, but mimesis can allow you to do so, but you need to think about, you need to kind of project yourself as someone being there. But also to draw to the outer world into their inner world. Empathy works exactly like that. How can you know that someone is in a particular mental state? You use empathy, right? You can think how I would feel if I were in their situation. And to lend expression to their interiority, it's happened every day. The fact that I'm giving this lecture, it actually does so. This is kind of how I express myself as an academician, as an academic, but also as a person, how we dress, so on and so forth. It's all part of that. Okay. So a few things about general conceptualization. If we kind of try now to anchor Kierkegaard as a thinker who is tapping into that long tradition of mimesis. Kierkegaard was an avid and critical reader of both Plato and Aristotle, both figures that engaged with mimesis significantly. Plato and Aristotle offer a bit of simplification here, two opposing accounts of and attitudes towards mimesis. And let me start with Plato here. Plato understands mimesis as representation, mostly of representation as a representation of objects or persons that can be mistaken for actual objects or persons, right? So hence for Plato, the problem with imitation is that a realistic representation of an X, which has a lesser value of existence than the actual thing, can be mistaken for it. Right? So he believes that if someone, just to give you a very pedestrian example, if someone takes a photo of me and presents it to someone else, it is believed that someone can mistake that photo for an actual person. And now it sounds a bit stupid, but if you think about the future avatars and some sort of virtual projections, it could be the case that in the future there will be possible versions of us, copies, right? So it's a serious problem. Truth for Plato can be mistaken for that which merely appears to be truth. If you pretend, right, to do something, if you pretend that something's true, Plato, if you have that power to do so, if you can pretend, Plato is a bit worried about that. Why would you do that? And what really motivates you? So there is this moral dimension there. Truth can be mistaken for that which merely appears to be true, or truth. Plato famously identifies poetry and poets as those who can represent reality wrong or misrepresent reality for what it is not. Through poetry, poets can represent figures that do not meet the criteria of moral exemplarity as exemplars. And as an example, here he gives Homer and his depiction of Zeus. So what he says, this is very interesting, what he says is that, when you read Homer presents Zeus as someone who is worthy of imitation, which means there's someone like Zeus who has all those qualities that we should interrelate, right? We should imitate. But what Plato notices that Zeus cannot restrain himself. There's this example when he basically he descends from his abode to earth, and then he has indiscriminate sex with women. And Plato says, this is really such a good trait to imitate. And he thinks, not really, right? Why is that so? Because it shows that Zeus cannot restrain himself. He doesn't have this moral quality of moderation, right? And Zeus, who is a better example for imitate? A god, right? So what Plato would say is that you have to be vigilant, even if someone you admire, that person even can be problematic. You need to have a knowledge of what imitation is about, what's the true virtue, and what is an appearance of that. So you have to be vigilant. So, however, as Plato suggests in the Republic, Zeus, who seems like the ideal, the most excellent model for imitation, has his weaknesses, if you like, or inclinations, and therefore one must not imitate even gods without careful examination. And this is something, when you think about Polis, when you think about John's lecture yesterday, right? To say something like that, the customs should be, evaluated, that's something big, actually. So they need careful examination. Even our models need a careful examination. When discussing the virtues of self-control, temperance, and self-restraint in the young, Socrates argues for the superiority of Odysseus over Zeus. So there's this figure of Odysseus who is not a god, but Plato would suggest under scrutiny, Odysseus has more moral qualities that are worthy of imitation. So the true philosopher for Plato, just to nail it down, is the one who has the knowledge to distinguish the real, meaning the truly existing, from the mere copy, obviously, a valued claim. It's representation which is of a questionable existence. However, this is quite problematic in the sense that one would have to have knowledge about the truth and its appearances, right, before actually exercising imitation. So Plato, if you just follow Plato here, Plato would say, well, people who should have, before we start imitating, right, we should have that knowledge what imitation is about and what is true, what is not true. And this is impossible, says Aristotle, in response, because we are natural imitators. We just imitate by nature. Our capacity to practice imitation is basically just innate. We have it. We are born. That's how we function. That's how we learn things. So this ideal of Plato cannot be really sustained. This is impossible, says Aristotle, as humans are natural imitators and their capacity to imitate is innate. The problem is not merely epistemological, as Plato would like to see it, but moral and existential for Aristotle. Aristotle asks what it means to imitate. Right? He says, I'm not going to dismiss it, but I'm trying to understand it. So he tries to understand what is imitation. And instead of casting aside poetry is unworthy of our attention, Aristotle actually focuses on poetry. He believes that imitation is best represented in poetry. But poetry, and this is how understands Aristotle the difference between himself and Plato, is that poetry does not give us realistic representation of action. So we shouldn't take Homer as someone who tells us how to live, word for word, notch for notch. We should rather think about poetry as something that allows us to, what Aristotle says, improve upon our natures, end of quote. So we have a description of different figures in poetry, today in literature, right? But we are facing those figures not to be exactly like them, but to improve upon them. Okay, imitation, one just final note on that. Imitation in Aristotle is about human perfection and what is often common, going beyond the imitated object. For Aristotle, we imitate both values and the ways of forms of life of other people, but we also learn critical skills that can be useful to evaluate them in due course. So we imitate not just values as such, not just some modes of existence, ways of life, but also critical skills. We learn them from our parents. First they tell us, don't touch the fire, right? You need that very straight kind of normative information. But then they allow you to have critical skills, like you were burned by the fire, the small fire, how about putting your hand into an oven? Think, right? Use your critical skills. Maybe it could turn out to your disadvantage. And that idea is actually well researched by two very prominent scholars, Linda Zagzebski and Chris Christiansen, and there's a huge discussion about that in Journal of Moral Education, so if you're interested. Okay, so Kierkegaard joins that conversation, and he asks, why is it important to know all that? Why is it important to be aware of those guys? With regards to Plato, Kierkegaard introduces the concept of sin, Christian thinker, and asks, what if someone decided to deliberately deceive us in the sense of presenting appearances of an idea that is just mere representation of the idea? So what Plato would say, just to give you a background here, Plato would say people do bad involuntarily. They want to do good. That's, if they do bad, means that they mistake truth for wrong. But sin comes into the picture in Christianity, and Kierkegaard takes it very seriously and says, what about people who just do it with purpose, lie, right, or just pretend that they are who they are not? The problem is not simply epistemological, but also existential. Kierkegaard sees imitation as a danger to our authenticity. We can pretend to be ourselves, but in the end we can easily become someone else, and this is a big problem. This can be in relation to others, but also to ourselves. We can pretend to others that we are someone else, right? They may believe that we are not what we really are, but also we know that from modern psychology that if you pretend that you're someone else for quite a time, you can actually become that person, right? To some extent. As I will explain more detail in the second part of the lecture, this phenomenon of inauthenticity is for Kierkegaard specifically modern. So it's not something that Greeks were really accustomed to, but it's very modern. And it's part of what is called social imitation, or crowd psychology, or affective imitation, which we kind of have something as a very in common. We're very in common with that. Okay, Aristotle. Kierkegaard takes Aristotle's conceptualization of imitation to mean human creative engagement with possible descriptions of human life. Kierkegaard calls that stages of human existence, if you're familiar with that, or life views. So he says that there are possible ways of human existences. He comes with three main ones: aesthetic, ethical, and religious. There are variations of that, and he says we can, just kind of engage those modes of existences, and this can be helpful in our moral and personal development. The highest mode of existence is religious for Kierkegaard, where an individual engages with the paradoxical exemplar of God, man, Christ. Moreover, Kierkegaard thinks about imitation after Aristotle as an imitation of action. Right? It's not objects and people as such, but people in action. Hence, Kierkegaard stresses the embodied and performative dimension of imitation, not simply artistic pertinent to realistic representation in the arts. Okay, just setting the background here. Around the time Kierkegaard is thinking about writing his first, well, it's not first work, but one of his first major works, Repetition, he jots in his journal, he just makes a remark in his journal about Aristotle's account of poetry and imitation. So he's thinking about Repetition, that book, and in the meantime, he makes those interesting observations about imitation. There are several, there's 3. But this one is the most interesting for me, and I hope for you also. He says, all poetry is imitation. Aristotle, in the brackets, and then he writes, better or worse than we are. Then he writes, hence poetry pertains beyond itself to actuality and to the metaphysical ideality. It's an interesting quotation. So he really gets Aristotle well. Right? He knows that Aristotle is about not realistic representation, but it's more about better or worse than we are. So you can use poetry, imitation, to think about yourself and to envisage oneself as someone who is actually better than the model represented in poetry, or worse. Better or worse, right? Better someone who goes beyond that, or just there was this discussion about the movie Nymphomaniac by Lars von Trier. I watched the first part. I think I have enough, but there was this conversation about whether this movie set standards, right, for us. So people were thinking, I hope that those who saw that movie, in the moralizing sense, will actually try to be, in the moral sense, a bit better than the main character. But someone said, but it can be worse, right? Because representation can actually stimulate to be better or worse. Okay, so what do we take from this quotation? It's not about realistic representation. Imitation is not about realistic representation, but it's a concept, it's a medium with which confrontation or engagement allows us, as he says in his journal entry, to become better or worse than we are. Imitation, the other thing is, imitation via poetry links actuality, the real that occurs in time, like the now, the now, today, in this room, with ideality, the realm of the ideals. Right, so imitation is not just somewhere out there, but actually it's something very pertinent to our reality today. To summarize, mimesis imitation, Kierkegaard suggests, means more than a simple reproduction or representation, or often in artistic representation that is timeless and abstract, a painting or an image or a sculpture, right, or some sort. But rather a creative production that has value, is historical and occurs in time. We will see that understanding of imitation, mimesis, playing out in the Repetition, the book to which we are just turning right now. So this is just a slightly teasing bit for scholars who believe that there is not much about repetition or imitation in Kierkegaard's authorship. I just have here 5 points where imitation and repetition is really at work in that work. One is the very title is repetition, right, which is a type of representation. Scholars say, yeah, okay, that's probably about that. It's not really the case. It's kind of a tool that he engages. Okay, so the pseudonymous author's name is Constantin Constantius. A typical name, right, obviously. But then there's much more there. You have autobiographical remarks in the work. You have textual repetitions of Kierkegaard's life. For example, he's breaking up. There's this woman, Regina. She's just too much for him, and he breaks up with her, and he has to kind of deal with that. And he writes about it. People have different ways, and he kind of goes over it, without being able to get over it, I suppose. And the other thing is his trip to Berlin. So those things really happen. So he just it's actually reality that enters imagination enters the realm of poetry, representation. It's interesting, right? From reality to art. The content of the book is repeated not in an idiomatic way several times across its sections. Some phrases are repeated, like just Recollection's love, an author has said, is the only happy love. 2 pages down, Recollection love is the only happy love, says the author. But it's interesting that it's always repetition with a difference, right? It's almost the same. You have almost, I think you have the same word. I think so. I have to double check. But he changes things, so he can say the same thing in a different way, textually speaking. The last one, literal repetitions of similar themes or new themes in Fear and Trembling, and 3 are building discourses. So what happens with Kierkegaard is that he writes simultaneously pseudonymous works. He has all those pseudonyms, and he also writes and publishes. Because it's more about publishing schedule. At the same time, he's written signed works, right? So people are being confused what's really going on over there. But all those, in the same time, you have this kind of mutation of subjects in all those works. So someone who is an attentive reader in a very obscure town of Copenhagen of no meaning at all, the author Kierkegaard believes that someone will pay attention and will see all those nuances over there. Well, let me just delve into the very content of the work. So here are some main instantiations or framings of repetition as a mimetic concept, qualifying 3 elements of human life, namely movement, imagination, and existence. And let's look how these interrelate. So let's start with movement. So in the work, I will just unpack it as we go, obviously. So repetition and recollection, the same movement in 2 opposite directions, says Kierkegaard. Repetition as a true and meaningful movement in time. And he comes with a case study of love. Then imagination, we have positive, forward-oriented imagination. In imagination, we can envisage ourselves as different, and subsequently return to reality to realize that vision, right? For example, I can think about myself as a plumber, to be a plumber, I think I need some tools. I have to buy them, right? Maybe I need to set up a company, talk to the tax office. So I have to do all those things. So imagination allows me to do so. And there's also negative understanding of imagination, negative, suspended in timelessness. In imagination we can ponder some great moments from the past and some future-oriented visions of ourselves and dwell on it in the timelessness of imagination. So I can just return to an event from the past and I can just think about it. Oh, that was great. Yeah. And not really realizing my life. Just, I can be, someone who is completely impoverished, but in the past I was rich and I can just sit in my room with no furniture, completely desolate, and thinking about and replaying all those scenarios when I was gambling in Las Vegas somewhere, or Macau, something like that. As I would do, obviously. No, I wouldn't. Okay, so the opening of the first part of the book, called Report by Constantin Constantis, introduces us to an anecdote about a classical discussion among Greek thinkers about the possibility of movement. In this passage, 2 ways of thinking are being contrasted. A very abstract, ideal way of thinking that disregards human experience in the world, and B, the very experience that we have in the world. And here is a quotation from the book, which actually opens the actual book. It says, when the Eleatics denied emotion, Diogenes, as everyone knows, came forward as an opponent. He literally did come forward because he did not say a word, but merely paced back and forth a few times, thereby assuming that he had sufficiently refuted them. And Kierkegaard is a specialist in the classics. So when he writes about that, he also assumes that we are, and that his interlocutors are. Some of us maybe, but assuming that I am the reader, I'm not a specialist in that area. So what is happening is here that you have those Eleatic philosophers, Greek philosophers, who are just sitting over there and just thinking, is movement possible? You know, but if you have to make one step, you actually first have to do half of the step. But to do the half of the step, you have to do half of it. And it continues. So in the end, movement is not possible. You cannot just make a step. And some other examples go over there. So they're sitting over there speculating. And the guy who comes as their opponent is Diogenes of Sinope. So what he does, he basically makes a step. So it's like, I don't really care about those guys just sitting over there and discussing, movement in an abstract manner, but I can just take a step. And Kierkegaard says, is this really a successful refutation of the problem of movement in philosophy? And just to give you the very outcome of that, he says no. Because if you just focus on speculation, you will be abstracted from real life. But if you just do the very movements, you're not connected with your thinking sphere, with your reason. So he's choosing the third way. He comes with a synthesis. And in that sense, he is a typical Hegelian thinker. He just makes a synthesis. It's not Hegelian, also you have that in Kant and some other thinkers. So in this anecdote, Kierkegaard challenges us to see that these two ways of thinking about reality based on abstract operation of the mind, German idealism, German romanticism, and on the other hand, based on human experience of the world, pure empiricism or natural philosophy, or becoming very prominent in that time, British empiricism, on the other, should not be kept apart in radical opposition, but should, in a sense, together to account for a meaningful way of thinking about human experience in the world. Kierkegaard's concept of repetition aims to do exactly that. So what he does talk about repetition because he really wants to account for a meaningful experience. So he wants to just think about how our daily routine, drinking coffee, doing our things daily, are they important to our life or not? Should we completely dismiss them? Or should we take them seriously? One important claim Kierkegaard makes about repetition is that it is both similar and different to recollection. Repetition and recollection represent the same movement but in opposite directions. So he's very smart, he's not very super dismissive, but he's trying to say it is like this, but it's different. It's different than this, but it's like that. In a sense, right? So here's a quotation. He says, say what you will, this question, the question of repetition, what it is really, will play an important role in modern philosophy. So if you know Deleuze, if you know Badiou, if you know the if you know Derrida and so on, he envisaged that repetition will be actually there, and so many other thinkers, by the way. For repetition is a crucial expression, right, for what recollection was to the Greeks. So he knows that there is this idea of the recollection of the Greeks, but he says our times have changed. We live in modernity now. We account for a very experience of the today. Just as they thought that all knowing is recollecting, modern philosophy will teach that all life is repetition. Okay, what does it mean? Repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions. For what is recollected is repeated backward, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forward. And this is a very puzzling thing. How can something be recollected, repeated forward? So this is how he make the distinction. Recollection pertains to the pondered object that will stay in the past. But repetition is about transcending the now and bringing the past into the future. And what is this reasoning here? This fragment the quotation makes a distinction between recollection and repetition. Recollection is focused on things that happened and are in the past, and when pondered over, will stay in the past, or or as captured in the mind. They will be held in a timeless realm of imagination and will never be actualized. In contrast, repetition is oriented towards the future, which, although initially grasped in imagination, I can envisage myself as a plumber, right? Ultimately becomes translated into the actual existence. I can translate that, I can become a plumber, right? It becomes real. In that sense of the repetition, we can do two things, and in and through repetition. A, we can transcend the now in imagination and venture into the future. An object of our reflection will determine our actions now and in the future. As an example, is the plumber. That's the example. I can realize that envisage a vision of myself, my would-be plumber being of Wojciech in the future, if I focus on things that I kind of envisage and bring them into reality. I can just think about the fact that I need to buy those tools, spanner and some other tools. I just kind of think about other tools. But if I won't buy it, I won't be a good plumber. I mean, I can just come to a place and say, yeah, that needs to be fixed, but I have no tools, right? So how to fix that? But in a very peculiar sense, however, in repetition we can come back to an event in the past, in a reflective recollection. And then, and this is crucial, we can import that thing from the past to our current lives in such a way that the thing from the past becomes an element of the present and even of the future. One example would be if you are bitten by a dog. If you are bitten by a dog, I've never been bitten by a dog, but just thought about that as a good example. You will be avoiding dogs. So this will qualify. You're just walking through the market and you will see dogs. You will be avoiding them, right? But you will also be thinking about avoiding dogs in the future. So an event of the past can actually kind of qualify your now and your future. So it can be both an event from the future, an event from the future, and events from the past. To summarize, for Kierkegaard, the true repetition in relation to movement, imagination, and existence occurs when the contemplated action becomes real, when thinking and action meet. Trying to explain repetition from another angle, Kierkegaard contrasts it with recollection and link it with love and happiness. Kierkegaard states that recollection leads to unhappy love, while repetition to happy love. And here is the reasoning. And when you think about it, that reasoning may be a bit outdated for us in the modern sense, but you have to think about this kind of milieu of the Romanticism, where people were kind of thinking about their beloveds, not even talking to them. So they were talking to those representations of the beloved, right? Writing letters, you have that all romantic, interesting phenomena. So recollection and an unhappy love. So what's the reasoning? So we have recollection and unhappy love, and repetition and happy love. That's the difference. So recollection and unhappy love. These are based on hope directed towards love, a hope for love, a hope to be loved. Such an agonizing expectation, which Kierkegaard calls the restlessness of hope, is destructive. If you are in a relationship, I'm just trying to make sense of it, for Kierkegaard, you should not hope that you will be loved, that the love will come, that someone will love you, that whatever is between you and someone else will turn into love. This hope will make you unhappy, miserable, depressed. It will wear you down. That's Kierkegaard's reason, that's his criticism of Romanticism. The other thing is that if love arrives, you cannot be sure that you will actually like it. Right? Quote, hope is a new garment, new cloth, but it has never been tried on, and therefore one does not know how becoming it will be or how it will fit. So what he's trying to say is that if a recollection, so just kind of awaiting that the love will come, will basically kind of wear you down. It's basically make you a miserable person, bitter in many ways. But if it comes, maybe it's not what you expected. So it's just not reasonable to rely on that. The same applies to recollection. If you are in a relationship, you should not dwell on the good stuff from the beginning of the relationship, because the beginning was precisely, and this is Kierkegaard's interesting observation, the beginning was precisely this agony of uncertainty. Right? We maybe think about, it was good time, the first 7 days. Well, the world is changing fast, so it probably I'm a bit too optimistic here. But you may think, these were good times, but actually those good times were not that great, because it was this uncertainty, right? There's just unknowing what's going to happen. The agony of making a move and losing the ideal and transitioning from the real memory of the realm of memory and imagination. That's the dilemma. So you can actually dwell in this representation of your beloved, but the real life is about making the move and actualizing it. I see some smiles there. So, okay. So how is that recollection and just dwelling on some representations of the beloved one and just living this miserable life of does he love me, does she love me, does she not, is different from repetition. Repetition and happy love. Provided that one is truly in love, obviously that's a claim, one doesn't need to hope for love. You don't need to wait for a better love. You don't need to trade off. And because you are experiencing it, unless you are not, right? One doesn't need to return in recollection to love, to good old days. What one should rather do, one should kind of realize love every day. That's what Kierkegaard wants. You have to repeat love. One should rather act on love repeating what one already has. Moreover, love does not simply is, even when we have it. It must be constantly repeated, actualized in time. Love, like many other elements of human life, must be experienced in the here and now, must be in a sense brought back to existence, must be repeated. Only in repetition we are able to fully inhabit the actual world. This Kierkegaard suggests criticizing an ideal of life that is very immediate in the sense that you do when you feel like it. It's some sort of uncontrollable spontaneity, lack of agency of reflection. You feel like you just, stimulation comes in and then you just react to that. His critique, however, is also directed towards a life that consists of constant reminiscences about how good it used to be, or one that fully focuses on planning, conjecturing, and speculation that will never be realized. Right? We all have, unless we are like that, we all have this friend who always talks about how things will come or what they will do, and they never do that. Right? Okay, yeah, I've heard that. Repetition is the category that is also important for a unified vision of life, and this is something very intricate about Kierkegaard. In that respect, Kierkegaard indicates that representation allows for our self-identification, self-recognition, a form of identity, continuity. Imagine a scenario where every day you wake up as someone else with different memories, different body, in a different country, in different context. I mean, you would go crazy, right? Without repetition, our life would be scattered, would be basically completely fragmented, would be random. Hence, unintelligible to us. We wouldn't be able to fully be ourselves. How would we? Right? We need memories, we need the same environment, so on and so forth. So we need repetition. So interestingly, Kierkegaard, in a sense, rehabilitates repetition, something good. He writes, and this is a longer quotation, and maybe take time to read it. And I'll just... Can you read it from the back? Is it good enough? Yeah. Okay. So in this passage, which is an interesting passage, I believe, Kierkegaard suggests that the human life is stretched between the same and the new. Right? Both, taken individually, represent undesired extremes. If life were completely new every day, you wouldn't recognize. It would be some sort of like Black Mirror scenario, right? Where just basically you'd be completely, we call it event, that something that has never been repeated will never be. One instantiation. If it were just a full undifferentiated repetition, it would be completely, there would be no movement, there would be nothing. It would be like inanimated objects in existence. If life were to consist of just the novel, we would not recognize ourselves as ourselves. If it were to consist of the same, which he calls the memorial volume of the past, we would not be able to live in the world meaningfully, right? Who could want to be a tablet on which time writes something new every instant, or to be a memorial volume of the past? Your life will be fully written, right? There is nothing, no event happening, right? Moreover, repetition qualifies ontology, and this is very interesting. The world, as he says, continues because it is a repetition. It is God herself that repeats it in a process of constant creation that is in time. So this is interesting. It's a very new reading of Kierkegaard, very new reading of Christianity as this kind of processual creation, that God constantly creates the world. Every day is being created. In that sense, it's being sustained. Lastly, we need repetition to inhabit the world. We do so by recognizing similar spaces, people, foods, landmarks. Otherwise, the world, a stream of unrepeated novelties, random non-similarities, pure events, would not be recognizable to us, and we would never be able to feel at home in the world. And I think I'll stop here. We'll take a break. Yeah. And then we'll look into two other instantiations of imitation mimesis in Kierkegaard. All right?